Okay, cool. So in terms of, we're basically going to stay like within this type of ground and area, and we're going to go in the quad going counterclockwise in terms of telling a story. So it's like we're going back in time and then we're coming back to this place. And we're starting here because what it is this is the site of the old statue. This is where the Egerton Ryerson statue used to be. Fun fact, Egerton Ryerson and I have the same birthday. This is a very fun fact. So in my own way, as well as Serena Johnson, who used to be at this university, in my own way, I feel like this is a way in which, spiritually we're connected. And I was a part of the movement to change the name and to also take down the statue. So, with that being said, I'll introduce myself formally. Tanzi Bojo, Sego, hello, bonjour. My name is Sam Howden. I'm originally from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm Red River Métis. I'm also, on my mother's side, my mom was adopted, Dutch and English. And I came to Toronto, Treaty 13. You'll hear this land acknowledgement a lot. As you're at this institution, it was created many years ago by the AEC and by Hayden King, who said formally in a CBC article that he very much regrets writing it, and we'll get into that later. A long time being in Treaty 13, which Andrew will talk about and pick up. We're also in the Dish with One Spoon territory, and sometimes you'll hear a lot about the two-row wampum, so we'll get all into that. But for now, I'm going to let Andrew introduce himself, and we're going to get started on this walk.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sam, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out today. It's really great to have this turnout. My name's Andrew Lougheed. I'm a seventh generation settler, originally from the Three Fires Confederacy territory, which is known in English or by its European name of Essex County. So I've been a guest here on the Treaty 13 lands for now 14 years. And I've been, one of the ways that I come to this particular talk is through my activism around changing the name of Dundas Street here in Toronto. So I'm the author of the petition that began that process. And I think that's a good segue into kind of talking a little bit about the history of Treaty 13, which is the agreement, you might have heard it called the Toronto Purchase. And Treaty 13 is the 1805 Toronto Purchase, which replaced the 1787 Toronto Purchase, which was a treaty of such dubious legal provenance that even the British were like, this isn't good enough. So Treaty 13 remains in effect. It's one of the documents that governs our relationships on the land today. It was negotiated between the Mississauga, the Credit, and the British Crown, and later renegotiated after multiple violations, incursions, and illegal territory seizures. It was renegotiated and settled in 2010. And so I think one of the reasons it's important to reflect on that so much is that so often we're told when we talk about things that happened before we were born, that it's relegated to kind of this idea of the past that is somehow separate from our present day. And I think ideas like realizing that these relationships are still undergoing negotiation is really important. And it's part of the work that we're going to do today is reflect on how land and territory is continuously being negotiated very much in our present. So yeah, I think that's one of the important things that we'll be undertaking today as we walk through the land.
And so, as you can see behind us, I'm going to turn around for a minute. So we have a plaque here, which was put up before the statue was taken down. That was a lot of the work of the AEC and Cher Trudeau, who's also here, and a lot of other members of our community. It was first kind of in contrast, obviously, as you see these kind of like Toronto normal school signs, which we will get into by Andrew's kind of part of it, and Egerton Ryerson statue, as a way of showing people what the real histories are. Demonstrating to them that there is always another story that is on top of another story, right? And so I spent a lot of time here in 2021 And previous to me, a lot of people, a lot of other Indigenous and student activists on this campus spent a lot of time fighting the statue and making artistic protest attempt from BLMTO, which then formulated the Standing Strong Task Force and led to a lot of activism last summer in 2021. So what we did here a lot of the time is it was a multifunctional space. It was kind of like a free school where I was teaching people a lot about the nations in this territory, the Mississaugas of the Credit. I was teaching people a lot about residential schools. I was giving folks tobacco who were community members so that they could pray and put tobacco down so that they could recognize the first bunch of children, the 215 that was found in Kamloops down by the statue as a way of commemorating. It was also a sit-in site. It was where we had a lot of items, bundles, shoes to represent people that were lost, and what we did a lot last summer to kind of commemorate what happened. There was a lot of material consequences the first time around when the statue came into contact with activists, with paint. There were 3 members that have still material consequences to this day because of what happened with the statue and going up against colonial forces. And the statue itself, which we will get into later, is actually created out of bronze. And bronze, if you know, is an alloy between copper and other ingredients. And those materials created that statue of Egerton Ryerson, but copper is really sacred to Indigenous people. And Indigenous people in North America use copper on and off for many different things: tools, knives, axes, arrowheads, but also ceremonially, why I'm holding a copper cup full of ceremonial water from the last full moon, which I did in ceremony myself, is to respect that element and also to respect our relationships with it. So with that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that Sam's done really great there is really kind of demonstrate why we're doing a walk like this. So, you know, through continuing to tell the stories of activism around the statue, around the name changes, we keep these stories alive on this land, because so often they can be really easily absorbed into institutional narratives around progress or change and development. And remembering that these are like hard-won victories is really, really important. And so this kind of walk is kind of a way of you know, keeping the statue falling or keeping the name changing. And I think that's a thing to remember as we walk through, because we can also see, if we look at the land around us, the traces of that activism that are still here, from the you know, the black spray paint on the plaque of the Toronto Normal School here. We can still see signs of that resistance that are still really fresh in the landscape, and you know, they leave these traces, you know, of what the so-called past really here and living in the present. And while we think about that, and before we walk over to the quad, I want us to think a little bit about the streets that surround this. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I was really active in helping to start the process to rename Dundas Street here in Toronto. But this university on all sides is surrounded, the entire campus is surrounded by names directly connected to histories of enslavement and histories of colonial violence. From Dundas, of course, to the south, and Dundas himself played a role in obstructing the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. We also have Yonge right to our west here, which was named after a fellow, the British governor of the Cape Colony in what's now known as South Africa, who also participated in slave trading. We've got Jarvis on the east side, a member of the Family Compact that governed Upper Canada, the colony, the British colony here, who enslaved people himself. And to the north, we have Gerard and Carleton, all of whom are folks connected through their business dealings with James McGill to enslavement and to resource extraction, which is another kind of recurrent theme of the talk today. So I just wanted us to kind of think about how that sets a tone for the built environment that we enter into every day here on the university campus. And yeah, I think that's a good time to start maybe moving into the quad and talking about a few more things once we get in there, yeah? The first kind of stop we want to make on this this kind of walk is the facade that you see here, and this is one of the remains we'll encounter here in the quad of the Toronto Normal School, which is the institution founded by Egerton Ryerson that is kind of considered the forerunner of today's ex-university. The institution was a direct result of Ryerson's report on a system of public education for Upper Canada, and it's why you often hear folks talk about Egerton Ryerson as the kind of founder of Ontario's public school system. Unfortunately, that vision for public education did not include education beyond elementary school for women. It did not include integrated education for Black and Indigenous students with their white counterparts. And where we're gathered here today in front of this original portico is where the statue for Ryerson first stood before being moved to its location outside of Kerr Hall. The Normal School was also a forerunner of a number of institutions that we know here in the Toronto and Greater Toronto area. So things like the University of Guelph comes out of the Normal School. It was also home of the Veterinary College, so that gave us Guelph University, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Ontario College of Art and Design are just some of the examples of the and the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, today's OISE, all come out of this building. And I think it's important to kind of focus on a little bit of what the architecture of this building can tell us about what it did. And you know, if this sounds like a kind of deviation into getting too deep into like kind of architectural history, I want us to also bear in mind the words of Denison architect James Bird, who says that architecture creates spirit and environment, and architects are responsible for creating an affect, whether they do it intentionally or not. And so when we think about built systems like this building, we can see it's got this neoclassical facade. Its interior would have been more a Gothic interior, so think like you know, like a medieval church or Hogwarts or something like that. And that's because the building occupied a dual purpose. So it was also home to the Ministry of Education for a short time. So as a public building, the architects, Ridout and Cumberland, wanted it to say public building, so they chose a neoclassical facade for it, but its interior as an educational institution was modeled off a Gothic revival interior that they thought, you know, symbolized education. And you know, Cumberland in particular has a really interesting kind of connection to broader colonial projects as well. He also worked with the English architect Sir Edward Barry, who was responsible for designing the British Parliament. He was an apprentice working with him. And we think that might be one of the reasons that in modern day Kerr Hall, you hear Westminster chimes played each time on the 15 minutes as perhaps a nod to the history of Cumberland and his involvement with the Palace of Westminster. So yeah, I think we can talk a little bit more about Kerr Hall a little bit later on, but at this point I think it's probably good to shoot over to Sam, because we're going to talk a little bit about the natural environment around us as well.
So in this area, like in the quad area, in the Kerr Hall buildings, which I'm sure you've had the pleasure of trying to navigate, what you'll notice is a lot of Asian species of trees that are like that have been placed here and are not natural and original to the environment. So we have a lot of fruit trees which satisfy the birds. There's plum trees on this side, we'll get to on the other side. There's a lot of Norway species of maple, but not the sugar maple, which is really important to maple syrup production, and also obviously maple syrup in our communities. There's a bunch of conifers, and there's other kind of small bushes, which are also mostly from Asia, and vines, which are from different parts of Europe as well. But what this used to look like, what this environment used to be, because the lake used to go quite far, Lake Ontario, and the waterways and the streams are evident from this kind of path over here. So there's two streams that converge just slightly north of us, and one is Moss Park and then Maple Leaf Stream. And so you can kind of see the way in which it used to come through this area, and it used to be very like low water and wetlands, and there used to be cattails. There used to be a lot more traditional foods in terms of wild rice, traditional medicines which grow in water, and also sweetgrass, and like low waterways in which you could navigate instead of roadways and concrete, in which we're constantly, tapping our feet on these days. And so right now, if it's possible, I want you to kind of imagine how we're interacting with the past and the present at the same time, what that would have been like. And that there used to be birch trees here. There used to be eastern white pine. There used to be eastern cedar in this area. There used to be lots and lots of different species of plants and animals. And the red-winged blackbird. The red-winged blackbird occupies a lot of swamp area. And Michael, one of our colleagues, has a great talk on this, and it's about how blackbirds were the original land defenders. Because if you've ever been down by the lake, and you've been by red-winged blackbirds, you know how incredibly territorial they are. They're really territorial. They're trying to protect their own, and they'll swipe down at your head, and they'll try and get you out of the way. And so imagine, while we're interacting with this environment, who those original land defenders might have been, or how we interact with treaty with creatures so that we can pass through their territory and with us alongside. So let's walk around the corner. So I'll point out some things to you, because I have some background in food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty, and I study a lot of plants. And so this is one of the medicines that people have been given on contact. This is broadleaf plantain. Broadleaf plantain was kind of like an adopted medicine that we put into salves a lot of time. You can actually eat this. Don't eat it here because it's not very healthy here. There's also a lot of dogs in the area, so I wouldn't suggest it. But it's full of vitamins. It's full of nutrients. It's like an original salad that you can just see on the sidewalk as you go through your life. The other thing that it does, though, is it shows you evidence as to how it is resisting concrete and the environment around us. And so as I point out medicines along the way, the more and more you engage with us, and the more you kind of get out of this whole like, oh, I want what's between cement as to what's underneath it. What we're trying to get here in this walk and kind of uprooting is those other stories, those other plants, those other relationships that we have. This guy back here, that's an invasive species. It's a taproot. It's called burdock. It has many different medicinal uses, but again, it's an invasive species. But if we edge along the side here, I've been trying to figure out, because it's fall, it's hard, it's not the most fertile time of year, what other indigenous species I can show you. Goldenrod. Okay, so I hope they're, I'm gonna get up. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So this is goldenrod. You can use goldenrod, it's an analgesic, which means it thins the blood and it helps with purification. And it also is a natural dye, so around August, you'll notice it start to get really, really yellow, and it's all along the lakefront. And you can use that natural dye to pigment cotton and linen and other things, but it also helps the body purify. So this is called lamb's quarter. Lamb's quarter, again, it's around almost all the time. Lamb's quarter is like so nutritious. There's like so much vitamin A and vitamin C, and it's like Mother Nature's spinach here. And it's actually, you should eat it when it's quite young like this. Again, I wouldn't advise doing it here. But it's something that you can use as a green and that is natural to the area and is indigenous to the area. So that's another one of our friends. And so as we walk along, I'll keep like pointing stuff out. If anybody knows plants or plant species, I'm looking for clover. I'm sure you'll find it before I will. But I can do a little bit of a teaching on clover as well. Okay, so this is wood sorrel. Wood sorrel is actually super delicious. Wood sorrel to me is like Mother Nature's Sour Patch candy. Unsuspectingly, it looks like clover, but it's not. And what it tastes like actually is like very lemony and fresh. So you can like take this and like crush this up in large amounts as like the kind of lemon flavor in like a natural pesto. And it's super delicious. Or you put it on top of salads or whatever. And this is just everywhere below your feet, everywhere as you walk around. What I wanted to bring a little bit more attention to, because each of the species that you normally see in this area are again imported and of an Asian variety. So this is a rose bush, and rose and strawberry are related. I wish we had strawberries down here, but we don't. This is still a very landscaped area that hopefully one day will look more traditional again. But what rose is in the family, so it's like a cousin to strawberry. And strawberry is a really important one of our teachings, or has a lot of important teachings in it. It's a heartberry. When you're really sad, or you need support, and it's also like a women's medicine, and there's different aspects of that. There's berry fasts and traditional things that, like, even as older people, I think, who haven't been introduced to ceremony, that we could start to bring back. But what it is that we get a representation of the family in which the strawberries are related to. And, again, as we're moving through this space, and you're hopefully in different parts of your body, not just in your brain as you're listening to this talk, we're going to go around the edge and we're going to start to interact with a little bit more public art and architecture to see how, again, on top of this landscape, we've been navigating this space.
So this is one of the places I want to stop along our walk and think again about kind of how public art shapes our impressions of the environment. We've got this nice bronze here of the Bird of Spring. It's created by Etungat, who's an artist from Cape Dorset in what's now Nunavut. And what's been really interesting, what's caught my eye this morning, is that you can see on the plinth down here, someone's written with Sharpie, "Stop the mining and stop extraction," and it's really kind of interesting because this sculpture was donated by the Devonian Group in Calgary, which is, in addition to a real estate company, they also made their money in oil. And the founder of the Devonian Group, Eric Harvey, was also really active in kind of collecting Indigenous ceremonial artifacts and building a kind of like collection in a very 19th century way about it. So lots of objects that you shouldn't have been collecting, that sort of thing. But those collections actually formed the basis for the Glenbow Museum in Calgary. And so I thought it was worth mentioning that while we have Indigenous art and presence on the campus, that it also comes to us through this kind of history of resource extraction, and it starts to build up kind of this very ordered picture of what we're experiencing here in the Quad, a very ordered landscape where, you know, certain plants have their places, certain peoples have their places, and then we think about, you know, the more modern architecture that encloses it. You know, the modernist architecture that you see around us here in Kerr Hall is deeply connected to kind of post-war kind of European social utopian projects, particularly after the Second World War. You know, modernist architecture, particularly on the university campus, becomes the favored architectural language, rather than, as we saw, the Gothic or the Neoclassic, which is also kind of intimated through the cupola at the top of Kerr Hall where the clock is. It's actually based off a kind of an amalgam of clock towers that you would find at Oxford and Cambridge in England. And so you have this kind of space, right, that kind of really gives you, in particular, a kind of, you know, ordered notion of what the kind of Canadian nation state is trying to say architecturally, and is this real kind of microcosm of it, particularly in a university setting. You know, modernism and brutalism, which you can see in our libraries, were picked up as architectural styles expressly linked to new expressions of the Canadian nation in particularly around the centenary, so in the late 1960s as well. So yeah, you've got this kind of built environment that is really like tries to kind of paint a picture of the kind of what is Canada as a nation in this space. And I think one of the most powerful things, and it ties back to the way Sam has spoken about the plant species that we see around here, is that we've got around us, we've got Boston ivy growing on the walls, so probably a nod there, thinking about you know, Harvard or something like that to relate sort of to that. It also feeds birds, though. But intermixed in this too is riverbank grape, which is an indigenous plant species of climbing vine that would have grown along the waterways like those of Maple Stream and Moss Park Stream here. And that would have been a food that Indigenous folks used to sustain themselves and would forage for in that area. And it's interesting because a lot of times when you think about, when people talk about landscape theory or landscape architecture, there are a few folks who suggest that all landscape has within it sort of the seeds of its own destruction. And so in the climbing plants, in the indigenous species that climbs alongside it, intermixed with the ivy, is this plant that is, you know, pulling apart the building brick by brick. And I think that's a real powerful metaphor that we can reflect on when we're thinking about the work that has been done here, the work that is ongoing, and the work to be done in the future. And I think that's a good place to hand it over to Sam to say a bit more.
And so there are some really beautiful original landscapes that are still, you know, or aspects of them that are still around us, particularly by the Humber River. But one of the things that I was listening to Andrew, and I'm finally in my body because it took me a long time. It took me until about here to be like, oh yeah, we're breathing, we're seeing green, we're doing things. That, you know, much like there are a few indigenous species in this area and quads. They're still here, they're still evident, they're still present, but you have to look for them. But also the other thing is that seeds are always in the soil, and under the right conditions, those seeds are just asleep. And so they will wake up again. They are in this soil, they are in this territory, and not just alongside and pulling down buildings, but they will thrive again under the right conditions when the diversity and the type of environment in which they were around before basically starts to reemerge and come back. And so nearing the end of our walk here, I'm going to invite you, because I have one more thing to say. I know we went over time, but I want to talk about the copper in particular, and in my way, it's the Indigenous people's way, and also the activism that happened around, I would call it Miichi Pishu's revenge, because the statue came down. We also invite you to stay if you do have time. We brewed some cedar tea, and you can come and imbibe with us as we sit by the statue, or the OG statue as to where it's gone. We've ended, we're kind of coming to the close. So thank you so much, like Chi-miigwech, merci, like for taking the time to actually engage with Andrew and myself and everybody else here that was present. Chi-miigwech to Derek and Darren for filming this for us. And the organizers of Social Justice Week, Kike and Salman, for all of the amazing support that they continue to do and have been doing for such a long time. There's a lot of folks to thank. I'm just happy that people came out, to be honest. We were going to do this regardless, interrupted by Westminster bells. And I'm just very thrilled to see that you wanted to come and listen to us and you wanted to hear these stories. So with that, I'm going to backtrack to the elements that are actually like held within that statue, and why it's really important, not only that, like, you know, you're thinking about things in terms of like political movements, in terms of land parceling, land agreements, treaties, and also land use and land back, but also thinking about elementally that statue and what it was made of, and why there should be something done with the statue in and of itself because of its elemental copper. So copper is the third largest element in our bodies. Copper helps us function. Energetically speaking, it carries electricity. It's in our phones to help us communicate, to help you write right now. But it also is part of our ceremony. And so that's why I think it's incredibly, incredibly important that something intentional is done with what is left over from the Egerton Ryerson statue. Because at an elemental base, that relationship, that element belongs to Miichi Pishu, and it belongs to the people in this area, and especially the Great Lakes. 1.8 billion years ago, there was a meteor that hit in this area and gave us the most purest form of copper on the face of the planet. And it sits here within the Great Lakes. And that's why there is Miichi Pishu. So it's a great water lynx that's protecting and moving, and mostly we think occupies Lake Superior, the biggest and most intense of all the lakes. But it's interconnected through waterways. And I've been carrying with me this entire walk some full moon ceremony water, in copper in particular, so that I can give it as an offering for everybody that was here, and also to respect Miichi Pishu for keeping that copper here and bringing it back to the people. So Chi-miigwech, merci everybody for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.